was a fairly good father and husband in my family. I worked at church, I worked at Scouts, and there's the dark side of me, secret. I was building, I guess, toward the perfect murder. I've accumulated a lot of deaths, a lot of hurt and shame on my family.
We've been tracking it down. The dogs are somewhat territorial as well as vicious.
By 2005, the worst thing most people had to say about Dennis Rader was that, well, he was a huge dick. Now pushing 60, Dennis spent most of his time just walking up to neighbors' yards and taking a good look at their grass, and wasn't the least bit shy about whipping out his ruler to make sure it didn't exceed the 6-inch limit. And if your dog was off leash, well, there Dennis was trailing behind with his tranquilizer gun, or, sometimes just a real gun. Neighbors really just noted the chipper arrogance of a wannabe cop who lorded his compliance officer badge around like he was the king of Park City, Kansas. Of course, Wichita had a storied and well-documented dark period. Murders, letters, phone calls, terror, all-out panic. But all of a sudden it all went poof. For 25 years, no one had heard a peep. The crimes had stopped, and the killer had to be dead or in prison. Serial killers don't just stop, right? The idea that whoever this was largely now forgotten, and a sea of Teds, Jeffs, and Garys had eaten away at the killer. But something would compel him to re-enter the conversation, vehemently announcing to all of Wichita that he was in fact still kicking, and that he might just strike again. But unfortunately for him, he was a fucking idiot. Hello, and welcome to the Downward Spiral with your host, Mr. Funk Nasty. If you're in need of a dark real-life tale, perhaps a serial killer deep dive, well, you've come to the right place. Tumble with me to the bottom of today's Downward Spiral. He'd like you to call him BTK. I've always preferred the floppy disk dumbass, and without further ado, this is the case of Dennis Rader. Police didn't know exactly what they were even looking at when they walked into the home of the Otero family back in January of 1974. All they knew was a mother, father, and 2 young kids had all been fatally suffocated with a plethora of different objects. An 11-year-old girl left suspended from a sewer pipe. Did someone have a vendetta against the Oteros? Police quickly jumped to drug deal gone wrong, organized crime, but the Oteros didn't have any enemies. They were just an honest, hard-working family who'd just moved to town. It wasn't long before all those theories just kind of fizzled out, and the police were back to square one. Home security was a booming business in 1970s Wichita, in large part because there was a guy going around rounding up people in their own homes and doing unspeakable things to them, starting with the Otero family. Despite the city's size, Wichita, especially then, had the quaint and close-knit vibe of a small town. The crime rate was fairly low, and murders happened, but not ones like these. Seemingly no one was safe anymore. Men, women, children, eventually the elderly were all being targeted in their homes. Home security system, that'll do the trick. Now imagine the man coming to install that fancy door alarm to protect you from the killer on the loose was in fact the killer on the loose. By 1979, 34-year-old Dennis Rader really had all of those sought-after things in life. The wife, the kids, the house, and a nice steady gig at ADT Security where he'd come to your home and hook you up with all the security fixins. Everything looked great on the outside. Family man, career, big on that sweet lord. But there was a crack or two along the way. Cracks that really only his wife saw. Little sneak peeks into another side of Dennis. Paula Rader just happened to come home one day, when she wasn't supposed to, and she walked in on something that she wasn't supposed to see. And what was that? It was that and that and this. What the fuck, right? What the fuck is that? Well, that's Dennis. He liked to put on his wife's underwear and other people's as well, masks, things like that. And also, for my money, probably the most unfortunate pioneer of the selfie. He would like to take pictures while he was doing it. And that's what his wife walked in on. But, luckily for Dennis, the 1970s wasn't really a decade of, hey, let's expand on that. Dennis kind of just chalked it up to, just horsing around. For real, though, she was extremely disturbed by what she saw. I think she even went and saw a counselor who told her that, don't be alarmed. It's just, it's a guy thing. He told her he just had some weird hang-ups and they just moved past it. But back to the $1 million question, what the fuck and even more importantly, why the fuck? Dennis Rader was born in 1945, grew up in Wichita, Kansas. He'd actually moved from Pittsburgh as a boy because his father, who had a military career, had secured a job at a gas company in Wichita. Dennis was the oldest of 4 boys, and fun fact, his other brothers turned out normal. His mother, Dorothea, had worked as a bookkeeper, and, by all accounts, they weren't the, stereotypical horrible parents that you see in a lot of these serial killer cases. They didn't have a lot, but they had enough, and, they had the Lord. They never missed a Christ Lutheran church sesh on Sundays, and by all accounts, they were just your average lower middle class family in Kansas. Dennis tended to spend more time with his dad, who took him camping, taught him to trap, hunt, things like that. But he also had a good relationship with his mom. There was a time when he was a teen where she did find some, crusty underpants and told him, hey, JC's not going to approve of that. But there really was this, aha moment for Dennis when he was about 6 years old. He had seen his mom get her hand stuck in the couch. She'd been wearing her wedding ring and doing a little vacuuming between the cushions of the couch, and the ring got snagged in the couch, and she was pulling it for dear life and became frantic and actually told him to go get a neighbor, and Dennis was like, okay, in a second. He liked what he saw. He was transfixed on the image of his mother helpless with her arms stuck in the couch, and it was at that moment that he knew that he was a big fan of the suffering. And that kicks off the downward spiral. Around this time, he had also watched his grandmother butcher a live chicken, and, it made him feel all fuzzy-wuzzy inside. And he would just kind of chase that feeling. Classmates said that they saw Dennis hanging turtles. I mean, come on, man, not the damn turtles, Jesus Christ. But he also experimented on dogs, cats. The only other takeaway that classmates throughout elementary school, high school had to say about Dennis was that he was utterly devoid of humor. Around this time, he'd also become proficient at tying knots because he was a Boy Scout, and he would also play cowboys and Indians with his brothers in the barns that they grew up around. The fantasies progressed to people. He dreamt of building a silo of terror where he would torture women, dreamt of putting women on train tracks waiting for the train. This is all while he's very young in school. He had also stumbled upon his dad's stash of detective magazines. They were really popular in the 50s, 60s, often showed real crime scene photos, women scantily clad on the cover and all that, and he becomes just obsessed with this one case, Harvey Glatman. Harvey Glatman was known as the Lonely Hearts Killer back in the 50s, and he would basically approach young women on the street with a nice camera, offer them modeling work, and when he would get them back to his place, he would pull out his camera, tell them that he was shooting pictures for the detective magazines and had them tied up and everything, and then he would tell them what he was going to do to them, and would actually capture the authentic look of terror on their faces. He was also fascinated by this one case back in 1959. This family in Kansas, the Clutter family, were all tied up and killed by 2 guys. He just went back and replayed that crime scene in his mind. He liked that rope was involved. He also began stalking at a really early age. At 11, there was this teacher who he felt had been domineering and mean to him, so he responded to this by going to the woman's home at night and watching her through her window with rope tied firmly around his waist. He was a bona fide freaky deaky before even hitting high school and would continue to peep and watch people as he progressed through high school. After going to college for a bit for electrical engineering, he ends up doing a 4-year stint in the Air Force, which took him all over the world, and was honorably discharged in 1970 at the rank of Staff Sergeant. But while Dennis had received an accolade for good conduct in the military, he was still exhibiting extremely fucked up conduct throughout. He'd continued peeping, burgled for women's underwear across many break-ins, and would wobble to and fro on a barnyard rope, doing the thing that the Lord don't like. Just the activities of your average young blossoming whippersnapper. Fun fact, he often didn't even need the hand, if you know what I'm saying. He, however, was incapable of feeling post-nut clarity, and that has to be true. Anyway, it was shortly after leaving the Air Force that Dennis's parents introduced him to a girl in church, Paula Dietz, and it wasn't long before the two were married, had moved into a nice home in Park City, just a couple miles away from Dennis's parents' house, and Dennis would secure what he always described as his dream job, working in aviation, building aircraft at an airbase. A lot of serial killers have this moment, especially at the start, where they try and do a crime, but they bail halfway through, they panic. Dennis had been watching this young bank teller come and go from work, and one day he tries to make a move on her at her car, but after a bit of a struggle, he just says, "Oh, I just wanted your car," and runs away. But it wasn't long until shit really hit the fan in 1973. The aviation industry, which was huge in Wichita, agriculture and aviation were the two biggest things. There had to be some tough cuts due to the rise of gas prices, and Dennis was one of those cuts. He was so pissed when he lost that job, and now with his wife working at the VA hospital as the sole breadwinner, he just felt, like an angry little bitch, and the anger fused with the deviancy, and he decides right there and then that he is going to take all of his feelings out on someone. During the winter of 1973, Dennis is driving his wife to work because she didn't like to drive in the snow, and he's out trolling for projects. What he called the trolling stage was just stalking, watching a person come and go, picking, selecting a person, and the person was the project. One day he spots Julie Otero taking her two young kids to school, 9-year-old Joseph Joey Otero and 11-year-old Josephine Josie Otero. He would call this project, or PJ Little Mex. For 2 months, Dennis watched the Oteros come and go from their new home. They had just moved 6 months prior to Wichita. Joseph Sr., the father, had a 20-year career in the U.S. Navy, which took the family all over the world, and they had been living in Puerto Rico with Joseph's parents when he secured this job at a small air base in Wichita, and that's when he moved him and the 5 kids and his wife. Interestingly too, Mrs. Otero actually worked at Coleman Company, where Dennis had briefly held a job building camping equipment. They didn't work there at the same time, but it's just a coincidence. Just got their new home. They had no idea what was about to happen. On the cold morning of January 15th, 1974, Dennis Rader approaches the Otero home on foot with his quote hit kit containing a gun, cutting tools, rope, tape, other things. One of Dennis's earlier prototypes, which would be a lifelong dream for him, was to bring a woman to a farm. He had planned on bringing Julie out to the farm, but had just decided that he was going to do this break-in, and 11-year-old Josie had actually shifted to being more of the focus. He entered the backyard through the wooden gate, cuts the phone line, but then realizes there's already something he hasn't planned for. Dog tracks in the snow. That's when he sees 9-year-old Joey come to the sliding glass door with the dog. He hadn't planned for a dog. He also hadn't planned for Mr. Otero to be home. He was home, and he orders Joey to put the dog Lucky outside, and then Dennis comes inside with the gun pointed at the family. Dennis tells them that he's, this criminal. He's wanted out in California, and he's just coming through town, needs their car, and he'll be on his way soon with a few Scooby snacks. Joseph actually thought, oh, this has got to be some kind of sick joke. My brother-in-law put this guy up to this or something. One interesting thing in this case, the Oteros were all trained fighters. Joseph was a legit former boxer. His wife was trained in judo. I think the kids even dabbled, and there was no fight. He was able to de-escalate the situation, get them to agree to all be tied up in the back bedroom. And it's as they're tied up and waiting for this guy to, as he said, be on his way, when he one by one begins to suffocate the Otero family with a series of plastic bags. There's rolled up t-shirt gags, cord used in Venetian blinds, rope. The children screamed, watching their parents fight for their lives, and Joseph Sr. was the first to go. Julie continued to regain consciousness as Dennis alternated between her and the kids, with her saying her last words, "May God have mercy on your soul." In this moment, this woman said a prayer for Dennis. By this point, Dennis had barely gotten control of the situation. It was total chaos. It was a lot tougher than he anticipated just physically to do this to actual human beings for the first time. Sweat drenched his clothes. It was pouring out of his gloves like a faucet. Eventually, he leaves Josie, takes Joey to his own separate bedroom, and it was later proven through impressions in the floor that after putting on layer upon layer of bags and rolled up t-shirts over Joey's head, that he actually pulled up a chair to sit down and watch as this kid lost consciousness for the final time. He then led Josie down to the basement and asked her if the family owned a camera because he wanted to take pictures. She says no, and that leads to her final words, "What's going to happen to me?" To which he says, "Well, honey, you're going to be in heaven tonight with the rest of your family." He then hung her with a noose from a sewer pipe in the basement and gratified himself to the sight of her final moments. Dennis then stole a couple items. He called these his tokens whenever he would take things from the house. He took Joseph's watch, but also a radio, which was almost Dennis paying homage to the Clutter case, the case he was obsessed with, because the killers had taken a radio in that case. Anyway, he takes the Otero's car, drives it to this nearby grocery store where he'd also parked his car. That's when Numbnuts realizes he's forgot his cutters, has to go back to the Otero home, does that in his own car, and then drives home, changes, goes back to his family life. After that, 2 of the older Otero siblings come home, eventually a third. To their horror, find their parents. They had actually told police to basically shield their 2 younger siblings from this, not let them come home from school, and they were absolutely shattered when the cops told them that they were also found in other parts of the house. I can never get over this first case because not only is it probably the most messed up and disturbing crime he may have ever committed, but by every possible metric he should have been caught, but he wasn't, and it only emboldened his ego. The botched drug deal theory went nowhere, and they were just back to square one real quick. No prints, the killer hadn't made penetrative contact with any of the victims. All they had was, a man's stain left on Josie, around Josie. DNA, of course, wouldn't be a thing for many years to come, but the forensics team thought ahead on this. They took that sample from the basement and preserved it in every which possible way they could. They scraped a little off and they froze some. They had no idea that that would really one day pay off. Dennis was aware of the forensics of his day, and he would have a keen interest in that, not just because he was doing the crimes, but because, like a lot of serial killers, he actually wanted to work in law enforcement. He enrolled himself at Wichita State University studying administration of justice, where he would learn about people like himself, about crimes like the crimes he was committing. And of course, between classes, he would be on the prowl, trolling. If his wife asked where he was, he just said, I gotta study late. And it was on one of these school trolling sessions where he comes upon 21-year-old Kathryn Bright checking her mailbox with a friend. Compared to the Oteros, Dennis thought this was a walk in the park. Single, lived alone, young college student, coincidentally also a Coleman employee, but again, he didn't know her from that. He decided she was going to be Project Lights Out. On April 4th, 1974, just months after the Otero murders and just a couple miles away from the Otero home, he smashes through Kathryn Bright's back door and waits for her in her bathroom, but when she finally comes home, he gets another unexpected surprise. A brother. 19-year-old Kevin Bright had just been visiting his sister the previous day, but got snowed in, decided to stay the night at his sister's house. He didn't even live there. Dennis hadn't accounted for the second person and actually just got lazy on the kit, didn't bring his usual bindings, but same thing, the gun, the ruse, and then he just starts rifling through drawers, looking for whatever he can find, belts, nylons, there's a bandana, some shirts. He has Kevin tie his own sister up, and then he ties Kevin up in a separate room. That's when Dennis attempts to wrap this nylon stocking around Kevin's neck, but he shoots up, breaks free of the bindings, begins to fight Dennis, but Dennis is able to get a single shot off directly to the forehead. Starts fighting with Kathryn, trying to strangle her, then he goes back to check on Kevin. Kevin is still alive, shoots back up, and begins fighting Dennis for the gun, and he was very close to getting a shot off. He puts his finger on the trigger, but Dennis actually jammed the gun with his own finger. Dennis actually had a second pistol, and after he jammed the gun, he pulls his second pistol out and fires another 2 shots, one striking Kevin just above the mouth, another grazing the cheek, so another 2 shots, and he goes down again. Now back to Kathryn. Next thing he knows, he hears the door fly open. He runs over, and Kevin is stumbling down the street. May I remind you, this man has eaten 3 shots to the fucking face. He should have called this Project Shit the Bed at this point. I mean, the total mess. Out of all of his crimes, this is the one that should have got him caught, but it didn't. At this point, he realizes he's just got to get the hell out of there, so he takes his knife and just starts frantically stabbing Kathryn, and after this crime, he vowed never to use a knife again because he said it was a, quote, total mess and that he had no control over the situation. The brother has now reached a neighbor. Police are on their way. He gets out of there and is just sprinting down this neighborhood covered in blood and is somehow able to make it to his car parked at the nearby university and get the hell out of there. Kathryn was actually found alive clutching a phone and just kept repeating over and over again, "I can't breathe, help me," before passing away later at the hospital. Now, Kevin survived. Dennis saw that on the news and he actually considered briefly going back to, quote, hit Kevin, but before he could, a composite sketch was released. Not great. but it was really the best that Kevin could remember. But that's all the cops really had to go on, and they didn't connect this to the Otero case at the time. And to further muddy the water, these two brothers and their buddy actually come forward and confess to the Otero murders. There were crimes against children in their past and everything, but one problem, they weren't really mentally all there, and quickly their story was disproven, back to square one. But all Dennis needed to see was that arrests were made in his case. In October of 1974, a columnist for the Wichita Eagle receives an anonymous call. Listen and listen good, I'm only gonna say this once. There is a letter about the Otero case in a book in the library. Sure enough, Wichita PD go to the public library, they go to the exact book, this engineering manual, and pull out the note exactly where Dennis said he was gonna leave it. The thing you need to know about Dennis is he always wanted to be viewed as this very deep genius serial killer, but what he actually was a surface level dumb fuck who was barely cutting it as a serial killer thus far. He also couldn't spell worth a damn. In a deranged sea of grammatical fallacies, Dennis really poured his heart out, describing what a scary guy he was and how he had a monster inside that decides who's next, and that those three dudes in custody weren't the dudes who did the Oteros. I did it myself, and no one's help. Since sex criminals do not change their MO or by nature cannot do so, I will not change mine. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. What a fucking loser though. Who names themselves? He doesn't take credit for the Bright murder in the letter, but he describes the Otero murders with such detail that it can only be the killer. He knew things that only the killer would know. But at the wishes of the police and the Eagle decide not to publicize BTK, which God, that had to piss him off. Despite the snub, Dennis wasn't so eager to get his dumb little name out there because he was still petrified that something from the Bright case would come back to haunt him. So he just put his head down for a while, focused on school. He'd also been picked up by ADT security by this point, which, like I said earlier, there are a few things scarier than the concept of a serial killer being paid to be inside your home to protect you from himself. Ironically, they would be even less safe. Of course, it would be his job for many years to come, and he just focused on school, work, and family for a while. And just as the name BTK had made its rounds behind the scenes, everything just goes quiet. 3 years pass. Dennis has just been chipping away with his classes at WSU. He's spending time with his family, but he's also, of course, looking for his next project. Yeah, he really wanted to think of himself as like a top secret, agent, like a spy. That's why he used dumb words like project and other things. And, he was out in 1977 in his James Bond fit, as he called it, dressed in tweed, briefcase in hand. And it was March 17, 1977 that he approached the home of Project Green. Now, the plan this time was to go knock on the door. He had this fit. He had a whole ruse planned. Because Project Green wasn't home, he goes to another project in the area, Project Blackout, but that person wasn't home either. I mean, he's just dressed to the nines and taking straight L's at this point. I mean, he was pissed and desperate. He didn't want to waste the opportunity, so he just sees this random boy walking down the street. He thought, gee, this is a little boy. He must have a mom. That'll do. He approaches this 6-year-old kid named Steve who is walking home with a can of soup for his sick mother at home. She has the flu. This boy sees this guy coming at him, looks like a businessman. The guy comes up to him, pulls out a little picture out of his pocket of a boy and his mom and said, "Do you know these people?" Steve says no. Man says, okay, boy goes home. About 15 minutes later, a big knock at the door. It's the same man saying that he's a private detective, and that's when he shoves his way inside. Inside was Shirley Vian, sick in bed with her 3 kids. And he ditches the wanted excuse and just goes straight into, I'm a weird dude. I got some problems. I'm just going to do some things with ropes, and just bear with me, basically, and then I'll be on my way. She told her kids to do as the man said and actually helped Dennis block them in the bathroom by pushing a bed in front of the door. He had also tied it shut. He would boast about the humanity he showed in this case by getting Shirley a glass of water after she threw up to comfort her. Even though the kids were locked in the bathroom, they could see everything. There was a small opening in the door door, and Dennis began to suffocate their mother. One of the most heartbreaking details is as Steve is watching this happen to his mom with his brother and sister, he believes that if he could just get to his mom, that he would be able to free her and untie her. And he actually shouts out something along the lines of, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll untie you." To which Dennis responds with, "Don't even think about it or I'll blow your head off." One of the kids actually ended up breaking the bathroom window, which spooked Dennis, and Steve eventually breaks a hole in the door, frees his siblings. They come out and find their mom, but it's too late. Dennis would also later elaborate on this crime that he had planned on also tying the kids up, and said that he basically planned on doing the same thing he'd done with Josie Otero to the young girl in this family. Ran down to his car a couple blocks down the road and went back to work that day, dinner with his wife. The crime had all the signs of the man who dubbed himself BTK 3 years earlier. Electrical tape, cords, nylon stockings had been used on the wrists and the ankles. She was face down, plastic bag, rope, the same distinct knots. He had also, again, just like in the Otero case, left his genetic mark at the scene. And that last part would always kind of be Rader's thing. He would never actually physically force himself on a victim. Instead, it would just be about inflicting pain and then pleasuring himself at the scene. And one of the reasons for that, if you can believe it, is that he just thought it was too far. And also, he didn't want to cheat on his wife. The infidelity. What about the infidelity?
He was a hypocrite. And I said, I don't think that was the worst part.
But anyway, all signs pointed to BTK, but he wouldn't take credit, at least not immediately.
You will find a homeward side, 43, South Nancy Park.
I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand you. What is the address? 843 South Thursday.
That's correct.
It had been 9 months since the murder of Shirley, Vian, and Dennis had spent a lot of this time just kind of honing, realizing that he'd kind of botched his entire criminal career up until this point. Next one's gotta be perfect, he's thinking, and he decides that 25-year-old Nancy Fox, Project Fox Hunt, would be next after seeing her return home from her job at the mall. Single, lived alone, no kids, Dennis really went the extra mile to make sure that no surprises were gonna pop up this time. He told his wife he had to go study at WSU, and he actually did go to the campus, but left around 9 p.m. setting off to Nancy Fox's home with his hit kit. Knocked first to make sure she wasn't home, goes around back, cuts the phone line, enters through a window, and enters a home that is just decked out in the holiday spirit, Christmas decoration all over. When Nancy Fox comes home later that night, Dennis appears out of the kitchen and hits her with the, "Oh no, I'm just passing through town, I'm a weird dude, just here to do some weird stuff" shtick. He also brought a Polaroid camera this time and tells her that he just wants to take some pictures. To calm her down, he actually sits down and has a smoke with her before she said something to the effect of, "Well, let's get this over with so I can go call the cops." In his mind, he'd already, of course, decided that her fate was already sealed, but it just cemented what was already inevitable. After he let her use the washroom, she came back and she was gagged, cuffed, and bound at the ankles. And this, he always described this as his perfect crime. He wasn't on any kind of time crunch and just had all the time in the world to live out his twisted dreams. He ends up taking a belt to her neck, but basically keeps her on the edge of death, letting her regain consciousness over and over again. Grabs pantyhose, does the same thing. Loosen, tighten, loosen, tighten. While he was doing this, he was also whispering in her ear things like, "I'm a bad dude, I'm BTK," basically trying to reenact what he had seen in the Harvey Glattman case and snapping pictures. He eventually cinches the belt around Nancy's neck for the final time before relieving himself on her nightgown, taking some jewelry, her driver's license, and then getting out of there. Now, Dennis was really feeling himself on this when Numbnuts finally pulled off the perfect crime in his mind. In fact, he was feeling himself so much that right after the crime, he drives to a payphone in his work truck and calls the crime in. Now, they traced that call to a payphone actually located close to the ADT headquarters where Dennis worked, and he had been seen in the phone booth, just giving up his real voice. He's been seen again. It's not a Dennis Rader crime unless he completely almost fucks it all up. Shortly after this crime, Paula Rader comes across this piece of writing that was obviously written by her husband that he was working on, and it's a poem titled Shirley Locks. Shirley Locks, Shirley Locks, will thou be mine. Thou shalt not scream nor feel the line, but lay on a cushion and think of me and death and how it's going to be. Paula was like, "Hey, wait, Dennis, what's this about?" And he said, it's just a paper, it's just a thing I'm working on for school. And that was that. In fact, it had been a draft for the poem Shirley Locks that he would go on to send K-A-K-E, Cake TV, in January, followed by a 2-page letter in February. He fully took credit for the Shirley Vian case, but also took credit for Nancy Fox in another shitty poem titled Oh Death to Nancy. And this is where he also really begged to be publicly recognized. 7 down and many more to go. The BTK Strangler, Wichita Strangler, Poetic Strangler, Bond Age Strangler, the Wichita Hangman, the Wichita Executioner, Garrote Phantom, the Asphyxiator.
My name's the Human Spider.
I don't care, get out there.
No, he got my name wrong.
Get out there, you moron.
He also elaborated on the monster inside, calling it Factor X, basically his drive to kill. He even depicted it in this little stupid devil frog thing. He called it his little friend. A supernatural evil force that also drove the likes of Son of Sam, Jack the Ripper, the Hillside Strangler. He really just wanted to mention himself alongside those guys, really is what it was, and he wanted them to name him. He really wanted some publicity. Quote, how many more do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention? I mean, he was desperate. He needed it. He also one by one claimed and detailed 7 victims except one, number 5. He wanted them to take a wild guess on that one. Number 5 was of course Kathryn Bright, and the cops by this point started to go back and wonder if he also was responsible for that one. He also included this drawing of Nancy Fox, which accurately depicted the scene. While investigators and BTK could agree on one thing, it was time to announce him to the public. You know, the key to catching a sick son of a bitch like this is to just feed into him a little bit, to keep him talking, hope he makes a mistake, and they decide to go public with BTK.
Communication came in the form of a 2-page typewritten letter addressed to KAKE Channel 10. It was signed with the initials BTK.
The only person who would have the type of information that was included in the letter would have to be the killer himself. The initials that were placed there stand for bind, torture, and kill.
What kind of leads do you have?
Well, very honestly, we have no solid leads at all.
Now, they actually try something just kooky. They decide to air a subliminal message embedded in a regularly scheduled program. You know, they thought that this would just tickle the killer's fancy. The average viewer wouldn't catch it. It would just flash for a second. Here's what it looked like. It was a drawing of Nancy Fox's upside-down glasses that Dennis had included in one of his drawings, as well as the message, now call the chief. But sadly, it didn't work. He didn't see it. It went over his head completely. And just as they thought they were getting somewhere again, damn it, it went quiet. By 1979, Dennis and Paula had welcomed their second child into the world, Kerri, but also Factor X was just popping off the charts. He had to get back out there, and he spots this young woman, Rebecca, and decides he's going to make her his next project. April 28th, 1979, he sets off to her house, gets in by using a glass cutter on her window, and he waits, and he waits, and he waits some more, and no one shows up. Decides he just has to get the hell out of there, but he makes sure to grab some, underwear and other things before he splits. What he didn't know was that house belonged to the young woman's grandmother, 63-year-old Anna Williams, who probably thanked her lucky stars that she'd been out square dancing late that night. She'd come home to find somebody had broken in, but time passes. There was no connection to BTK or anything, but then she gets a strange package in the mail with a drawing of a hog-tied woman and a poem titled Oh Anna. With the linguistic chops of a 3rd grader, Dennis tried to express himself as best he could the frustration he felt that Anna didn't show, with the final line reading, Oh Anna, why didn't you appear, BTK. The drawing was just meant to signify what he would have done to Anna had she actually shown up that night. Shortly after that, Anna, she packed her bags and moved the hell out of Wichita, which is what I would have done as well. He'd also gotten police familiar with his little symbol by this point, BTK, the B, of course, made to look like a pair of breasts because brilliant, obviously. Of course, scaring the bejesus out of this poor old woman still wasn't enough, and he fired off a letter to Cake TV bragging about this, I'm on the loose, I'm gonna strike again, all that. Now that letter, it had been photocopied over and over again to try and distort where it came from, but police are actually able to trace it to a copier at Wichita State University where Dennis of steady. He actually would graduate later that year, but unfortunately again, the BTK trail goes dead for a while. Kerri was 6 years old when her neighbor, 53-year-old Maureen Hedge, went missing from her home just a few doors down. She was just a kid, and all of a sudden, you know, this nice neighbor who often waved at them had gone missing. The neighborhood would soon learn that Maureen Hedge wasn't coming home. Her unclothed body was found in a ditch about a week after going missing in Park City, away from her home, and, you know, no telltale DNA sample left at the scene. No damn way this could be BTK. Knotted pantyhose were found next to her body, but really everything else didn't line up with the BTK killer. And on top of that, no one was rushing to take credit for it. Simultaneously, despite this down period, the police had still been investigating the unsolved BTK case. There was a task force created, dubbed the Ghostbusters. They'd enhanced and released the audio of that phone call Dennis had made after Nancy Fox, but no one came forward with anything credible. There were tons of leads, tons of tips, but nothing that was ever credible. Dennis, by this point in his life, had really cemented himself as a pillar in the community. After he graduated in '79 and trying and failing to become a cop, he just went all in at ADT security, you know, family life. He was balls deep at Christ Lutheran Church, was a well-respected member, put his son in Boy Scouts, the picket fence, the nice tree house he built. He couldn't just tell his wife he was studying late anymore. He had to tend to the yard. He was a devoted family man, you know, he had no time to devote to serial killing. Unfortunately, the thoughts hadn't gone away. They never do. Fuck.
I was a fairly good father and husband to my family. I worked at church, I worked at Scouts. Then there's the dark side of me, secret, and that's very strong. That was up there for a while. I guess you call that the cold stage or whatever, and then it starts to build again. There were times when I thought they were closing in, and I would move things around and kind of clean up a little bit. Fatherhood was big for me. I did not have time to do anything.
His wife caught him again. She walked in again to him fully splayed out in the main hallway of their home in such an embarrassing degree of rope and bindings that he physically couldn't unwind himself in front of her to, you know, tell her, you know, it's not what it looks like. He ended up just sleeping on the couch for a period of time, which seems appropriate. You know, you ought to really be casted to the couch for at least a couple days after that kind of tomfoolery. They hadn't talked for a bit, but when she actually addressed Dennis, it wasn't a, hey, you know, knock that off, mister. It was, you know, I'm taking the kids and we're getting a divorce if I ever see this freaky shit ever again. So he made sure to be on best behavior after that, but he was still doing things. He had crap stashed all over his house in the hidey holes, as well as all over Wichita in different barn spots and stuff, you know, just things that he took from people's houses, pictures, drawings, you know, all his fascinations. One thing that got him by was these 3x5 slip cards. Basically, he'd be cutting women's pictures out of magazines, detective magazines, and he would be putting them on these cards and writing attributes, you know, their likes, dislikes, giving them a personality, and he would spend time with them as if they were his dates. Like this one, which says, "May I wrap Sparky in your hair?" Sparky was what he named his wiener. But, you know, he would talk dirty to the cards. He would, you know, bring them in the shower and have himself a stroke, as one would, right? Honestly, though, I would take that shit to the grave. Another way he'd get his fix was ADT actually took him all over Kansas and also Oklahoma, and he'd just be in these motels all by his lonesome. And it was during these motel stays where he would get his freak on. He called them motel parties, and he would just bring all his, you know, twisted shit. The camera with the cord running to his hand where he had a little squeeze ball and he could snap the picture. But it could all only hold him off for so long. Was it the fact that he'd laid low so long any of the heat that he might have incurred had dissipated? Was it the fact that he was just such an upstanding citizen by this point that he would never be questioned in a heinous murder, let alone his neighbor 6 doors down? Not the Christian Boy Scout leader. It all started one day when Dennis looked through his blinds and saw Maureen Hedge in her yard, as he had many times before, but this time he thought, I wonder what her neck would look like with my hands around it. On April 27th, 1985, Dennis headed off to a Boy Scout campout with his 10-year-old son, Brian. And, you know, using the Boy Scouts as a cover wasn't new. He'd done that before. He had skipped off to take lovely photos like these. Yep. Just a casual self-burying there. Awesome. This rainy evening, he told his son in the group, yeah, I got a headache, guys. I'm going to head off to my tent. He really wanted to improve his degree of planning, but it was just ridiculous. He went to a bowling alley for this one. He sloshed beer in his mouth to smell like he'd been drinking, and with slurred speech, he called a taxi to come pick him up, leaving his car at the bowling alley. Taxi drops him off. He walks by his own parents' house, cuts through his own lawn, gets to Maureen Hedge's house. Now, the thing about this was her house actually was the same layout as him and his parents, so he just knew it from top to bottom, cuts the phone line, gets in there. It's dark, no one's home. He's just got his bowling bag with a hit kit inside waiting for her to come home, and she does, but another surprise. She actually brought a date home. For how dumb Dennis is, he was at least a little older and savvier by this stage in the game. He wasn't a broad-shouldered spring chicken fresh out of the military anymore. He honestly had one of the most epic fucking glow downs I've ever seen. But if he learned anything by this point, it was to not take on brothers and boyfriends. So he hid in the closet, and he hid for quite a long time. He waited till she was fast asleep and then jumps out of the closet on top of her and physically strangles her with his bare hands, and just very quick and over with, less bind and torture, more just kill this time, but that was really only the beginning of what he wanted to do. As you'll find out in this next part, it always just amazes me how uniquely deprived and different all of Dennis Rader's crimes are from one another. He declared his MO in that moniker BTK, but all of his crimes took such different directions, usually because of his own stupidity, but this time it was because he wanted to cross something off of his bucket list. In the dead of night, Dennis drives Maureen Hedge's body to Christ Lutheran Church. Remember, as someone high up in the church, he had keys to the building. He had actually stashed plastic sheets and other supplies at the church days earlier in preparation for this. And right there in the house of the Lord, he poses her in several different bondage positions, as well as dressing her in different outfits he'd stolen over the years. His goal, as he later said, was to get high-quality bondage photos of a woman, which he hadn't ever gotten. He did take some pictures of Nancy Fox, but this was like the real deal for him. But he realizes that the sun is gonna come up soon. He has to get back to the Boy Scouts. He drives Maureen in her own car to this area, leaves her in a ditch, and lazily just kind of shuffles some branches over her before driving back to the bowling alley, driving back to the Boy Scouts in his own car, changing and crawling back into his own tent like nothing happened. Despite the phone line being cut and a knot being found, they still determined that this wasn't the work of BTK. They actually zeroed in on the poor date for a period of time, but he was quickly cleared and it just went cold. About a year and a half had passed since Maureen Hedge, and everything had kind of died down, but not for Kerri, Dennis's daughter. She was just a kid and had somehow learned that this happened to this woman. This nice woman down the street had been strangled, and to make it worse, she was at church with her parents just a little bit after the crime and had broken her arm, and just associated that with this crime, being rushed through the ER with a broken arm and the murder of Maureen Hedge. Soon after that, she started having night terrors. She dreamed of a man breaking into their home to come get her. Her dad, basically the boogeyman in that dream. It's chilling to think that he caused that in his daughter. It was actually revealed in different journal entries taken from Dennis Rader's hidey holes that he noted this change in his daughter in the journals, and it was actually implied in some of these writings that he got some sort of sick thrill out of seeing that in his kid. And I'll talk more about something with Kerri towards the end of the video that's even worse than that. But September 1986, it had been a year and a half, and with that, on Dennis's lunch breaks at ADT Security, he would come watch 28-year-old mother of two, Vicki Wegerle. He'd canvassed the house, had heard her playing piano in her home. When he finally made his move one day around 11 a.m., he was dressed as a fake phone repair guy, had taken a hard hat from work, put a little fake phone logo on it. He had a bunch of, phone-looking gadgets in a work belt. He knocks, she opens. It's just her and her 2-year-old son home. Her 8-year-old daughter was at school, husband was at work. Dennis told her he had to do some work on her phone, and she was really skeptical at first, but eventually she trusts him, and he starts tinkering on the phone, and the moment she looks away at her 2-year-old son, as she turns back, he has a gun pointed in her face. He tells her to go to the bedroom, and after attempting to bind her with random clothing items from the room, she breaks free and starts fighting with him, actually scuffs him up a bit, scratches him, but he ends up finishing her off with a nylon stocking. He then took some Polaroids, her driver's license, other items, and left. Now, while Vicki was still alive, she actually told Dennis that her husband Bill was due home any minute on a lunch break. And sure enough, when Bill is on his way home for lunch, his wife wife's car just passes right by him, and he could tell that it wasn't his wife driving the car. He walks in, he sees his son, who isn't harmed, but he can't find his wife for about 45 minutes until he looks under the bed and sees his wife, and there's a bind around her neck. Some cops thought it was BTK, more thought it was Bill, and for the next many years to come, Bill remained the prime suspect in his wife's death, and his kids would even get made fun of at school. You know, your dad did this. Bill was one of the people that believed his wife died at the hands of BTK.
Then the following year, 1987, this woman in Wichita, Mary Feiger, comes home to find her husband fatally shot, almost execution style, and her 2 daughters dead in the family hot tub. Black electrical tape and cord bindings had been used on the 16-year-old Sherry, and there was also a male discharge left in the hot tub.
Guess who, right? But not exactly. After the murders, the grieving widow, Mrs. Feiger, received a poem in the mail. Another one prowls the deep abyss of lewd thoughts and deeds.
I did not kill them, but I admire who did.
There was also a drawing attempting to depict what happened at the crime, but it didn't match up.
Despite the drawing, what was written and everything, the cops just thought it was a fake. They didn't think this was BTK, even though it was later proven that it was.
It was obvious he hadn't done it, but he was just reaching out for the thrill as a fan of whoever had done the crime.
By 1988, Dennis Rader had been at ADT Security for 14 years and had worked his way up the ladder, held a senior position at the company.
But, you know, he wasn't really liked by many people. He was a stickler for rules. He referred to this blue book, which was basically the rule book at ADT, and he would just, you know, hound people. And it was getting to the point where people were like, oh, fuck, here comes Dennis. God damn it. Eventually, it was actually his ego that cost him the job. He clashed with a manager who had a more flexible outlook, and his time at ADT was done. He ends up doing a short stint working for the census, which took him all over Kansas, and also right to people's doorsteps, which he loved. One big reason for him not killing during this time is the motel parties had apparently gone off the chain. Like, they were really, really extravagant and crazy by this point. He brought photos from the Marine Hedge case, also Vicki Wegerle. He'd splay those out all on the bed, also pictures of himself. He brought favorite pieces he'd collected from houses. You know, he had a favorite red bra, there was panties, other things. You know, he would be working all day and just foaming at the tip to get back to the motels. And honestly, I'm swearing off motels after this fucking story. You know, he would also continue to shower with the index cards, take them for long drives. He would set an index card on the passenger seat and talk dirty. Oh yeah, I'm a bad dude, Brenda. Again, would take it to the grave. There were over 30 projects that for whatever reason didn't pan out throughout the late 80s, but in the fall of 1990,
he sets his sights on 62-year-old divorced mother of 2, Dolores Davis.
This came at a time when Dennis was stressed for money. He was down after losing his job at ADT. His time at the census had come to an end. Dennis had actually worked at this grocery store when he was in high school. His mom also worked there. His wife currently worked there, and they actually decided to do him a solid, give him a gig installing security cameras, and that is where he came across Dolores Davis at the store, and then he would continue to watch her at her house. Dolores had just settled into retirement life. She'd worked as a cosmetic consultant and spent most of her time now just tending to her garden, and that's where Dennis would often watch her. He would call this PJ Dogside because her home was right near a kennel. On the night of January 19th, 1991, Dolores Davis was reading a book in bed and was awoken to shattering glass. She thought a car had struck her house. Just like the Marine Hedge case, he'd used a winter Boy Scout campout as his cover. His wife also had suffered an asthma attack, had to spend some time in the hospital. So while he has his son at Boy Scouts, his wife's in the hospital, he is setting off to kill this woman. His parents were out of town, so he drives to their house to change into his hit clothes. I'm guessing he also probably wanted to avoid Kerri at his house. He then drove to the church in Park City where the Scouts had equipment, and he also had things hidden in hidey holes. Also, just a random fact, Dennis, he would stay overnight at the church sometimes and go downstairs to the Sunday school classrooms and would string himself up. He got his things, set out to Dolores's home, and because of how cold it was, he just lost patience with figuring out how to get in, and he just hurls a cinder block through her window, waking this woman up, and she thought that a car had hit her house. He actually decides to bring back the wanted man ruse for Dolores, but she's not playing ball. She tells him to leave, and that's when he reveals that he has a gun and other things in his bag. She told him she was expecting a man over any minute, which caused him to panic and just start strangling her with a pair of pantyhose. Not a prolonged attack, no pictures, he had to just split. He drives Dolores to a wooded area, has to go back to Christ Lutheran Church, leave some things in the church shed, but then Numbnuts realizes that he left the gun at the scene all these years after the Otero murders, making the exact same mistake. He drives back, grabs the gun, grabs Marine's 35mm camera and also some jewelry, but it all wasn't enough. For this crime, he wanted to cross another thing off his bucket list, like in the Hedge case. He had always dreamt of bringing a woman to a barn. He never got to do it. He has a barn spot picked out and everything, and he goes and he picks up Dolores from where he left her and starts driving around in this snowstorm. It's foggy, it's snowy, and he just gets lost and decides he has to just leave her underneath the bridge and get back to the Scouts because he's also running out of time. Now he's back at the Boy Scouts around the campfire. This is the next day, and he can't get Dolores out of his mind. You know, it's all wrong. I didn't stage her right. I didn't do what I wanted. So he again leaves, goes and finds Dolores again. He staged her how he wanted, put a mask on her, took pictures, did what he wanted to do, left. But he was about to come closer than he ever had to getting caught. Dennis stopped at a rest stop to change from his hit clothes back into his Boy Scout fit. This highway patrolman pulls up. Now, keep in mind, Dennis has the jewelry. He has the camera in his car, but it's when he pulls the, I'm a Boy Scout leader, I gotta get back to the Boy Scouts, all this, that the cop is just like, all right, you know, that adds up, fair enough, and lets him be on his way. Dolores's remains were eventually found by this teen who was walking his dog. His dog actually ran up to the body. Again, similar binds and knots. There was a weird mask left next to Dolores, but the cops still didn't think this was BTK. They were still hung up on the idea that our guy doesn't take victims to different locations, and, you know, he pleasures himself at the scenes. There was no telltale DNA sample, and Dolores was the oldest victim. You know, just like with the Marine Hedge case, the police hadn't really connected those dots yet, that this guy didn't care about age. It was all just about finding somebody that just checked all his boxes to perform his fantasies on. One of the strange things that was found inside Dolores's home was actually noted by her son, Jeff. You know, besides the obvious signs of a break-in, there was a half-eaten bowl of cereal in the sink, but his mom was a meticulously clean person. She wouldn't go to bed unless all the dishes were washed, let alone, you know, a half-eaten bowl of cereal in the sink. He basically thought it was a joke by the killer, like serial killer. Now, that comes into play a bit later, so, you know, just remember that. Something else interesting happened too. In June of 1991, Dolores' son Jeff receives a letter in the mail. The writer was basically throwing out wild theories that the killer could have been affiliated with some radical religious cult, that it was someone who just couldn't control his urges because of a sexual addiction. God keep you in his living, scratched out, loving care. Whoever wrote it also said that it was connected to the Vicki Wegerle case, and he sent it off to the cops, who apparently didn't think much of it, and it just kind of went away. It was written by Dennis, but Dennis got busy again with his family, with his kids who were graduating high school. But there was also something else.
We've been tracking it down. The dogs are somewhat territorial as well as vicious, and we've been trying to round them up and corral them as best as we can, working with the reporting parties of where the sheep were killed.
Around 4 months after the murder of Dolores Davis, Dennis secures a job that would give him enough power and enough control over people that it kind of satisfied Factor X, or at least kept it at bay. Compliance officer, animal control. It just satisfied that wannabe cop inside Dennis, but it was almost even better because it revolved primarily just around putting his fellow Park City neighbors under a microscope. His neighbors would describe him as just your average neighbor. You know, he was cordial with people, he would sometimes wave, but then he would put that compliance officer uniform on, and it would just be a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation, and he would become the biggest asshole in the world. You know, he would just putter along in his little work truck going 10 miles an hour through the neighborhood looking for grass that was too long. He would pull up to a garage sale and say, "You got a permit for that? Shut her down. I'll follow you down to the courthouse house so you can get a permit, he always had his little camcorder out ready to record and would tranquilize or straight up put down off-leash dogs, or even if they just probably barked at him wrong. This one woman remembers him looking through her fence and trying to pepper spray her dogs through the fence, and the mist ricocheted back into his own face, which is fucking hilarious. What an idiot. But Dennis wasn't laughing, you know. He was crying. His face was blistering red, and he walked up to that yard with those two dogs and pulled out his shotgun and blew both of them away in front of kids playing. You know, this woman had neighbors and friends over, and they all just saw this. Neighborhood kids actually began to play a game where they'd see Dennis's white truck pull up called Hide from Dennis, which doesn't even sound like a game. That just sounds like a call to action. And there was another woman whose dog was tranquilized, and her lawyer had to laugh when Dennis arrived in court with a binder, 30 cross-reference exhibits all backed up by audio, videotape. Exhibit A, a picture of this terrifying dog outside its gate. I'm sure he feared for his own life when he took this photo. You know, they were there to fight $25 tickets, and Dennis is treating this like a murder trial, and he won. It was always, of course, women too that he was doing this to. He still wanted to have that power over women. He just did it in another way. But on top of all that, you know, the harassment, the dog murder, the badgering beyond the call of duty, there was something stranger yet. He'd been popping up in people's backyards who hadn't violated any one of the million codes that he enforced. They didn't have a dog. He had stalked women and was discovered in a couple yards with this little camcorder. He had been harassing one woman to dump her boyfriend, you know, get rid of him and your problems will disappear type of thing. And she had caught Dennis outside her window one day with a camcorder, confronts him. What the hell are you doing? And he's like, you know what to do, dump the boyfriend. Next thing she knew, she came home to a little sticky note on her door saying that her dog had broken free from the leash and had to be taken to the animal shelter. And when she got to the shelter, the staff said that they were given an order to put the dog down. That woman packed up and left Park City after that. Dennis was still ruining people's lives, even though he wasn't killing them.
It's also worth mentioning Dennis had 2 restraining orders from women for stalking, and I always wondered how he explained that to his wife. But there was also something else, a female co-worker of his. This woman reported him 3 separate times to the city of Park City for basically terrifying her, trapping her in his office, chasing her around the room, things like that. She reported this stuff to Rader's supervisor, who just flat out ignored it, and when she brought it to the city, they just deferred back to Dennis, who of course ignored the investigation into himself. To show you how comfortable he was in this job, he actually kept what he called the mother load in a 2-drawer filing cabinet in his office. And the mother load was just a mother load of pictures, drawings, cutouts, everything just crammed into this filing cabinet. He just kept that at his work. One thing outside of work neighbors noticed is that Dennis would just spend time in his treehouse sometimes. You remember that treehouse he built for the kids? Well, maybe it wasn't just for the kids. He was just going down memory lane, looking through binders of pictures, mementos from his crimes. All of this goes to show and disprove this kind of misconception that sometimes goes around about this case, that Dennis went totally dormant during his time as a compliance officer. He hadn't gone dormant. He was still doing a lot. He had upwards of 50 projects written and journal entries and stuff by this point too, and had even broken into a woman's place, waited for her, but on a time crunch had to leave.
I was building, I guess, toward the perfect murder. I had like 55 projects. People were pretty close to meeting the hand of death. Didn't happen. I could always fantasize or look for more victims. That was part of the excitement, is being able to do the hunt.
His job and simply the chase was enough to tide him over and maintain this, you know, outwardly normal image. But his kids did start to just be able to tell as they got older that their dad was, you know, a bit of a weird paranoid fuck. He had the front and back doors deadbolted since Kerri and Brian were small kids and would often come to Kerri and tell her exactly how people break into homes. He would also drill into Kerri that if someone came knocking at the door saying they were a cop or a worker of some kind, make sure to check their badge, check their outfit, make sure they are who they say they are. He knew from firsthand experience using those exact ruses to get in people's homes. As Kerri got older, he would teach her that when she was getting into her car to look behind her seats in case someone was in there, or check under the car for, you know, a skinny guys, he would say, like a skinny evil doer under the car. All that while keeping his hit kit in that bowling bag from from the Hedge case just hanging around where anybody could have looked at it. He had a chest full of mementos in the house. Side note, one of the most chilling things from Dennis's collection for me has always been that he had a squeeze ball to train his hands for strength because his hands would often go numb while he was tightening a grip around someone's neck. That slogan on the squeeze ball, life is good, but no one ever found any of his many stashes of stuff because the one big rule, don't look in dad's stuff, and no one did, including his wife. Of all people though, his wife had seen a few things. There was another instance where she caught him typing on her computer. He was, typing something up for the church on her computer, and she said, "You type just like BTK. You can't fucking spell. You're an idiot." She didn't say that last part, but she said, "You type just like BTK." There was also a couple occasions that Kerri and Brian saw where, a BTK-esque energy rose to the surface. Kerri had been off in university, but had come home for dinner with her family, and a dinner fight ensued, and someone ended up pounding the table. A table leg got pushed out. The table fell over. Dennis reacted to this by flying across the room and grabbing his 21-year-old son Brian by the neck and pinning him up against the wall. And the family had never seen anything even close to this. He had never actually been violent. Same year, 1996, this is 6 years after the death of Dolores Davis, her son Jeff receives another letter in the mail. He had just written a book about his mom. It was someone telling him just how great his book is. My heart pounded during the part where you went back on the anniversary of your mother's death to sit and wait for the killer. Jeff had actually gone back and waited for the killer in his mother's house. But again, just like in the first letter, the writer theorized it could be connected to Vicki Wegerle and also mentioned Marine Hedge, and that all three could be connected. The police again didn't really pay much attention to that letter, but it was later confirmed that Rader wrote both the 96 letter and the 91 letter. Cut to 2001, same thing happens again. Dennis strangles his son Brian, who's now 26, still living at home, but not for long. He decided he had to get the hell out of the house after this, and he moves out, quickly goes off to the Navy. 2001 is a significant year, not only because Dennis's kids had moved out, but it was also the same year that the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, was caught. Just like Dennis had served in the military, was a family man, had a son, took him camping, a bunch of outdoorsy stuff, had held the same job at a truck plant since high school in the Seattle, Washington area, all while getting away with murder for 20 years. And despite having the IQ of a box of Count Chocula, this guy was far more sophisticated when it came to the methods he used to avoid capture. He never left a lot of evidence behind and killed 5 times as many people as Dennis. And now he had been caught by DNA at a time when, DNA had been around, but not that long. And this was one of the more significant breakthroughs. It was a big story, and Dennis wondered, gee, could something like that happen to me? I'm sure somewhere in the peripheries of Dennis's disturbed mind, he always wondered what this day would be like, whether he would make it to this day, whether he would be caught, whether he would have done himself in by now. But there he was, walking his daughter down the aisle on her big day, his son off in the Navy, retirement on the horizon, time to spend a bit more time with the wife and put all that BTK stuff to rest. No more projects, no more motel parties. He could blow out a hip doing that now. It was time to get used to a little more boring. By 2004, the name BTK had, gone with the wind. Just another unsolved cold case that probably would never be solved. It was the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders when the Wichita Eagle ran this story, just going over the whole case and remembering the Oteros. And there was a little story in there about someone writing a book on the unsolved case of BTK. This attorney, who was also doing some teaching, was surprised when he would talk to students, young people, the new generation, about the BTK killer, and they simply hadn't heard of it. That's what gave him the inspiration to start the book titled Nightmare in Wichita. As author Robert Beatty expressed, he believed the killer would not strike again because he was dead or in prison. Dennis sees the article, that piece on the book, and just this general consensus that whoever did these crimes is gone, and he says to himself, nuh-uh, not on my watch. It also just didn't sit right with him that someone else was gonna write his amazing story. Well, in March of 2004, all of Wichita was about to be reacquainted with BTK. One day the Eagle receives a letter from someone named Bill Thomas Kilman. I hope you were paying attention, otherwise you might have missed that. Bill Thomas Kilman, BTK. Unbelievable, Dennis. It was 3 photocopied pictures of a woman's body and a photocopy of a woman's driver's license. It was Vicki Wegerle, and they knew that the killer took the pictures because Vicki had been rushed off to the hospital that day before they could take any sort of crime scene photos. 25 years after BTK's last correspondence and 13 years after his last murder, police knew 2 things. They had to clear Bill Wegerle as the prime suspect in his wife's murder, and that BTK was still out there. And also that he may have other murders that they didn't connect to him. The cops and the media, they weren't going to play around this time. They get the story out quick, and it just starts to snowball from there. A couple months later, May 4th, 2004, Cake TV receives a letter simply titled The BTK Story with these 13 different headings, these titles. You know, one said PJs, another one said Fantasy World, Treasured Memories. Basically meant to be chapters for his book. The last chapter, chapter 13, being the most chilling of all, Will There Be More? He also sent this word puzzle with a bunch of his taglines in it, but it also had the word address and 6220, which was his actual address, but they didn't discover that at the time. Next, a package taped to the back of a stop sign in June. It was a very step-by-step graphic account of the Otero murders told in the style of if he was writing a book, as well as a drawing titled Sexual Thrill Is My Bill. A round of applause for that rhyme there. In July, a letter showed up to the exact same library where Dennis left that note in the engineering book 30 years earlier, and with the contents inside, they decide to freeze releasing the correspondence to the public. I have spotted a female I think lives alone, just got to work out the details. I'm much older now and have to condition myself carefully. Also, my thinking process is not as sharp as it used to be. I think fall or winter would be just about right for the hit. Got to do it this year or next! ! Time is running out for me. Because it was basically him saying that he was going to resume killing, they decided, they didn't want to spook the public and they don't release that one. In the same package, there was also a confession to the death of this 19-year-old. The guy had died in a self-inflicted way, and, it had nothing to do with the case. He's now just copying the shit that he didn't do just to throw them off. In October, in a UPS drop box, another envelope was found. This time, there were pictures of children with bindings drawn across them. A poem titled Death to Landwehr, which was the lead investigator in the case. And there was also a fudged up autobiography where he just lied about a bunch of details about his life.
My father would womanize, he would drink, he would make outrageous claims like he invented the question mark.
But despite these attempts to throw the cops off, they had Dennis right where they wanted him, talking. But he planned on doing a lot more than just talking. As the cops are going through that letter, Dennis is in some woman's backyard at 59 years old, all his equipment and everything, but by the grace of some service workers coming to fix something, he had to split. And that woman, whoever she was, got to live. Couple months later, December, a significant package was found in a garbage bag against this tree in Murdoch Park in Wichita. There was a doll with a driver's license taped to the feet. It was Nancy Fox's driver's license, and this was a physical, actual driver's license. He'd sent photocopies and stuff before. The PJ doll was, of course, meant to signify Fox being bound in the exact same way, down to the color. There was also this letter just going into, again, graphic detail about what he did to Nancy Fox. First day of the year, 2005. Big day for Dennis. It's the day that he takes the reins as president of his congregation at Christ Lutheran Church. Dennis was really feeling himself by this point. President of the church, he's got this cat and mouse game going, and he's constantly reading, watching the news, cutting pieces out of newspapers about the new hunt for BTK. His wife saw him doing the cutouts. Reports that went out, news stories, they were all deliberately sensationalized and scripted in a way that it would keep the killer wanting more, keep him coming back and keep him talking.
BTK is a Cake viewer and has been for years. He has communicated with us since the 70s and it continues today. We know he is watching and we know he is listening.
This is one of the most challenging cases that I've ever been involved with. And I find that the individual that is doing this would be very interesting to talk to.
And then there was cereal. Well, cereal boxes. You see, because he's a serial killer sending cereal boxes. So yes, he left that bowl of cereal in Dolores Davis's sink.
Between 69th North and 77th North on Seneca. Contents, Post Toasties box. PJ, Little Mex, and Doll. Let me know somehow if you or Wichita PD received this.
On January 25th, Cake TV receives a postcard from BTK asking whether anybody found a cereal box he'd gone through the trouble to leave in the back of someone's truck at Home Depot. He also mentioned a Post Toasties box he'd recently left leaning against a road sign on this desolate, unpaved road right on the outskirts of Wichita. So they go out looking for cereal boxes. They find the one lying against the sign, but they don't find the Home Depot one right away. But then a worker from Home Depot comes forward, said, yeah, I did find this, cereal box in my truck, thought it was a prank or something, threw it in my trash. By sheer luck, the man hadn't taken his trash out to the curb, so it hadn't been taken to the landfill, and the box had been preserved in his trash bin for well over a week. There was a cereal box with bomb and BTK written on it, as well as some jewelry inside. There were some other writings, fake stuff about his life again. But the break really wasn't the box. It was the security cam footage they got of a man driving a black Jeep Cherokee, pulling up to the pickup truck, getting out, putting something in, and driving away. It was really grainy. They could barely make out the figure or the vehicle, but they knew the make of the vehicle. And just visually seeing that this is the BTK killer for the first time was also just a huge breakthrough. They'd worked through hundreds of suspects, hundreds, thousands of leads over the years, and now this is their guy right here. Now, the other cereal box left on that rural road contained another doll bound to a little pipe, obviously made to look like what he did to Josie Otero. By this point, a good year into this cat and mouse game, Dennis, he's gotten it in his head, this delusional stupid fuck, that the police are enjoying the chase, the cat and mouse game as much as he is. He believed that he actually had a special bond with the lead investigator, Ken Landwehr, and that's when he decides to ask a question. Can you trace a floppy? He wanted to see if they could trace a floppy disk back to a computer, saying at the end, be honest. But for real though, no joke, no pulling my leg, no bullshit. Can you trace a floppy? Come on now. Be honest. He instructed them that if they couldn't trace a floppy disk, to place an ad in the newspaper with the simple coded message, Rex, it'll be okay. They placed the ad. Dennis saw that and said, these are honest people. I have nothing to worry about now. He actually sends the floppy disk to a local TV station, KSAS TV. This is a test, there was nothing on it, but there was a whole lot on it. Whole lot of data. Dennis didn't know about the metadata. They actually thought that the killer by this point is this super intelligent, sophisticated guy, and that he is trying to get them to take the floppy disk so they could trace it to another suspect. Then he would know that they lied to him. And when they actually get the floppy disk, they're testing it, to see if it could be an explosive, incendiary device. They go through the metadata and see Park City. The user had logged into a computer at Christ Lutheran Church, and then they see the name Dennis. And a quick Google search, Dennis Rader, president of Christ Lutheran Church. Well, they do a little drive-by of his house. There's the black Grand Cherokee. Rex, it will not be okay. But not so fast. A lot of the police wanted to just rush in there. Ken Landwehr's like, no, I want to get the fucking cherry on top. I got to get the DNA. So they actually go and get a court order to go get Kerri's DNA sample from a medical appointment she had. And they match it up against DNA recovered all those years ago in his first murders from the Otero case. Kerri is the daughter of the BTK killer. And the BTK killer is Dennis Rader. It was a nice sunny February day. Dennis had spent the day just, hounding people about the length of their grass. And as he's driving home, there's helicopters in the sky. There's some strange vehicles around. He's like, that's weird. I wonder if that's for me. It was. He's taken down at a traffic stop. He sees the lead investigator. He says, why, hello, Mr. Landwehr. And in a very calm voice, he simply just said, hey, could you tell my wife I'm not going to be home for lunch? I assume you already know where my house is. When the FBI came to Kerri's door and asked her if she knew who the BTK killer was and said, that's your dad, of course, she didn't believe it. She was in total shock. She had even asked to see a badge, just like her dad had taught her all those years ago. As he was being interrogated, he quickly realizes that he can't get out of this. They have the forensic evidence, which leads to this moment.
I know that BTK is the father of your children. Of your children. I know that. No doubt. It's a done deal. The tests were done.
Say who you are. Why don't you just say it? BTK. You're BTK.
Ken Landwehr, he plops down that purple floppy disk just to see what Dennis's reaction would be, and Dennis says, I just need to know one thing. Why did you lie to me?
Because I was trying to catch you.
Because I was trying to catch you, you fucking stupid idiot. Dennis's DNA would also be linked to some of his other cases. Nancy Fox, there was also DNA recovered under the fingernails of Vicki Wegerle from fighting Dennis. And of course, on top of all the forensic stuff, they found a ton of stuff in his house, hidden all over the place in hidey holes in the walls, and also his mother lode in his office. And he really kept everything in there, even the correspondence over the years with the police, newspaper clippings. Basically, it was a complete documentation of his entire crime spree. Dennis's wife Paula, of course, also didn't believe it and was defending her husband up until he confessed. She actually got the court to waive the 60-day rule of divorce and applied for immediate divorce, which they granted her, and she basically just acted as if her husband died that day, according to Kerri. For me, the courtroom confession of Dennis Rader is one of the most chilling things you could ever watch, because he goes into the crimes in such a way that as if he's talking about the weather.
Was this a kit that you had prepared?
Yeah,
for him?
Yes, I called my hip kit.
What did you strangle her with?
I think on that I had tied her legs to the bedpost. Let me think now. Okay. Oh, I tell you what I thought. I thought the police were coming at that time. I heard the door open. I thought, no, that's it. Yeah, I went back and strangled her again. That finally killed her at that time. Either her feet were tied or not tied. Anyway, I think I had a belt. I took the belt and then strangled her with a belt at that time.
What happened then?
Okay. After I strangled her with the belt, I took the belt off and retied that with pantyhose, real tight. If you read much about serial killers, they go through what they call the different phases. That's one of the phases they go through as a trolling stage. You're looking for a victim at that time, and that you could be trolling for months or years. But once you lock in on a certain person, then you become stalking, and that might be several of them. But you really home in on that person. They basically become that's the victim, or that's what you want to do.
The level of detachment on full display for nearly an hour in that courtroom, while also going out of his way to tell you what a swell guy he was while he was taking the lives of several human beings. You know, he talks about bringing Shirley Vian the glass of water, sitting down having a smoke with Nancy Fox, loosening the binds on the Oteros so that they'd be comfortable. He also confessed to the crimes that they didn't know about Maureen Hedge and Dolores Davis. Dennis is now 80, said to be kind of withering away, failing health. According to his daughter, Kerri, in the past year or two, she's opened up a little bit more about things she believes her dad did to her. There's this picture of her dad that hasn't been released to the public where he's wearing a weird wig, but he also has like a baby doll in, his bindings and stuff. But even worse, in his journal entries from the hidey holes, there's a section from 1981 that says Kerri, and it has letters that signify the word bondage. Kerri now believes that, her dad did things to her when she was just 2. And what has Dennis been doing for the past 20 years? Well, mostly just this, whatever the hell these drawings are. And also sending Kerri letters every time a new birthday or Christmas rolls around. She had briefly kept some contact initially, but stopped responding altogether at a certain point. And there's always more questions with this case. Are there more victims? Did his wife know anything more? The topic of the wives of some of these serial killers does come up a lot, and how did they not know? I mean, Dennis's wife had seen certain things. I truly think she didn't know anything. Maybe she had a suspicion here and there, but you tell yourself that it's impossible because he makes you believe it's impossible. There are many things that could make one believe that he wanted to get caught. I mean, he left his home address in that 2004 word puzzle, and even just starting the conversation back up when he had gotten away with everything, everybody had forgotten about him. I think it's just really hard for people to wrap their head around the floppy disk thing. How could someone be so stupid? I think he just went down in the most hilarious boomer way possible. I truly think he didn't know, and it really cements it when you listen to him talk about how he's so mad that they lied to him. Even now in recent interviews, he is still upset.
Kind of like the scout oath, always be truthful. I just was trustful. But they had declared war on me, and wars are not nice things. I actually felt like they should have given me more respect, I guess, playing their cat and mouse game.
As far as more victims, Kerri Rawson, she was actually talking to her dad a couple years ago for the first time in like, I think 15 years to try and crack some cold cases. There was some speculation he could be involved in the disappearance of this 16-year-old girl, Cynthia Dawn Kenny, from an Osage laundromat back in 1976. After her disappearance, a man phoned police telling them that her body would be located in a barn, but she was actually never found. And there is a journal entry from Rader, Project Bad Wash Day, where he mentions watching a brunette inside a laundromat. And there's even information that ADT Security was doing some work at a bank across the street from the laundromat that day, but it's never been proven that Rader was actually there on the job. But there hasn't been a lot of new information about this, and there's a handful of other cases that have some similarities they think might have something to do with Rader. They also did find her name in the 2004 word puzzle that he sent. Other victims' names were also found in there too. Also in 2023, police went back to his old house, or where his house used to be. It was torn down in 2007, but they checked in an old hidey hole that they never looked at and actually found items in there. Quote, trophies from at least one woman, there was remnants of pantyhose and also binding materials. They've now gone to some barns and have evidence that he at least had been there, markings on the barns. I don't deny the possibility that there could be a couple other victims out there that he's holding on to, and just, again, he loves the cat and mouse game. Do I also think that, he would want to have credit for all of his murders? Yeah. One of the more chilling things in the case for me is that there are just projects that he never went after or waited in their house. There's people out there walking around right now that have no idea that Dennis Rader watched them. He was in their home. At the end of the day, what he really was a pathetic freak who wanted to seem a lot deeper and a lot more complex than he actually was. The Minotaur, the monster, Factor X. He lost control or had something go wrong in almost all of his crimes. He was a bad serial killer. And Dennis has been asked over the years why he did what he did, why he is the way he is. He describes it as cubing. You flip the cube to one side and you get the family man, you flip it to another, you get the serial killer. And he never specifically describes anything traumatic happening in his childhood, but there are experts that just feel that something had to have happened to him. And aside from, as he says, his sexual problems, his hang-ups, the most important thing for him was to be known. Well, Dennis, you'll always be remembered as Dennis the floppy disk dumbass. But anyway, I appreciate everybody watching this. I've been wanting to cover this case for a really long time, and it took a while. It took a really long time to make this. Hit it all, click it all. I say click it all. And until next time, ta-ta for now.